Good afternoon. My name is Anders Owens. I'm from Baltic Environmental Forum in Latvia, and I will be presenting the Latvian case study. The Latvian case study is focused on the transition from conventional to organic dairy and agro-ecological dairy farming systems. And it needs to be pointed out that Latvia, in terms of dairy farming, is well suited to dairy farming, as large grassland areas are too wet for crop production. But these grassland areas are very rich in plant biodiversity for grass-based feed production. Next slide, please. The two main dilemma that we identified for our case study and on which we focused on in identifying barriers to and seeking solutions are, firstly, how to increase the economic viability of conventional and organic grass-based dairy farms while preserving biodiversity in grasslands, and secondly, how to ensure that all organic milk is processed into organic dairy products. So in fact, in the case study, we're dealing with a supply and demand issue. In Latvia, dairy farms are typically family operations with a farm size of less than 25 dairy cows per farm. Milk yields are low, ranging from 5,000 to 6,000 kilograms per cow per year for organic and conventional dairy farms, respectively. And in fact, organic dairy farms have a very much lower, 50% lower production value per hectare than conventional farms. In terms of the processing of milk products, there are 50 conventional dairies in Latvia, but only 7 organic dairies, which are distributed very unevenly across the country. Presently, a very low premium is paid for organic milk, if at all, to farmers. And a major issue is that only about 40% of organic, as much as 40% of organic milk does not dairy farms are under pressure to increase economic viability, and this is resulting in the conversion of permanent pasture and use of fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, and chemical plant protection products. But nevertheless, dairy farmers have actively transitioned to organic farming practices incentivized by CAP support payments over the last number of years. And in fact, organic dairy farms now account for about 10% of all dairy farms and also 10% of all milk production. Next, please. Both conventional and organic dairy farms use very similar agro-ecological farming practices, and these practices in some cases are quite advanced. Most dairy farms practice grazing on permanent grassland. Most produce on-farm roughage and grain. Complex crop rotations are sown with clover in grassland. Mixes of legumes and grain crops are sown, and intercropping takes place whereby grain crops are intercropped with clover. In the case study, in order to address the dilemmas, a multi-actor platform was struck, and it consisted of both farmers and farmer associations and dairies and representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture and representative affiliated institutions, and also researchers, trainers, educators, and also the environmental sector. And the multi-actor platform came together in a series of seminars, workshops, discussion groups, interviews, and surveys, and identified the key barriers to the dilemma and also co-constructed solutions for the dilemmas. Next, please. In order to assess the impact of the transition to organic dairy farming practices, a sustainability assessment of several conventional dairy farms was undertaken using the Cool Farm tool, the Smart Farm tool, and the Compass tool. The assessment was undertaken through a modeling exercise which modeled a transition from conventional to organic farming practices. And as a result of this modeling, a series of trade-offs and synergies were identified. Trade-offs included a much lower milk production and a decreased crop yield by about 25%, and more grazing and greater proportion of roughage in the feed mix. But on the positive side, synergies included a marked decrease in total CO2 emissions, and also CO2 production was reduced per hectare and per ton of crop. Because of the elimination of mineral fertilizers and plant protection products, the modeling indicated an increase in species habitat and genetic diversity, as well as water and soil and quality improvements. On the economic side, the transition to organic farming practices resulted in a net value added, net farm income, and an increased labor productivity. And these increases were mainly due to the fact that the EU CAP subsidy play a big role in the total income of farms of about 50% for some of the organic farms. Next, please. Based on an analysis of undertaken by members of a multi-actor platform, a number of barriers to transition to organic farming systems in Latvia were identified, and these barriers are related both to supply and demand. Some of the supply barriers include insufficient support for transition to organic farming practices to compensate for reduced milk and crop yields. It was found that ongoing receipt of CAP Pillar 2 support for the maintenance of organic dairy practices produces dependence on subsidies and does not incentivize farmers to improve economic and environmental performance. It was also found that there is limited knowledge of agro-ecological practices for improved crop yields and weed and pest control among farmers, as well as advisory services. It was also found that small farms have a low level of mechanization and have outdated machinery and infrastructure, which all impacts negatively on farm performance. And presently, maybe most importantly, there is limited cooperation among organic dairy farmers and organic dairies, which really hinders the collection and processing of organic milk. Next, please. Some of the demand barriers that were identified include low public procurement of organic dairy products, and maybe most significantly, the retail price of organic dairy products is much higher, and this really impacts on consumer demand. And presently, there's a lack of an integrated overall organic farming and food policy to steer the development of the organic dairy sector in the long term. Next, please. Based on the identified barriers to transition, a number of policy measures supporting production were defined, including the following. It was thought that provision of premium support to dairy farmers during transition to organic farming practices would help to compensate for the large reduced milk and crop yields. It is also felt that differentiation of support payments for organic dairy farming practices based on the complexity of our agro-ecological practices and performance of agri-environmental measures would be a benefit. It was also recommended that provision of increased support to training of advisory services specialists and farmers on organic dairy and agro-ecological and agro-environmental practices is much needed. And it was also noted that the provision of preferential farm modernization investment to support small and medium-sized farms in transition to organic farming practices was certainly needed. Next slide, please. Additional policy measures identified which support production include the need for increased financial support for cooperation among organic dairy farmers and organic dairies to improve milk collection logistics, to increase processing of organic dairy products, and to improve the position of farmers in the value chain. And it was also recommended that a payment of a premium from the state support scheme to organic dairy farmers be provided for organic milk processed as organic dairy products. In terms of measures supporting consumption, it was recommended that adoption of mandatory green procurement rules for for organic dairy products would really help to increase the take-up of the oversupply of organic milk, which is present in Latvia presently. And to increase the uptake of organic milk, it was recommended to decrease the value-added tax on organic dairy products from 21% to 5%. And it was also felt that adoption of a national organic farming and food policy would really help to stimulate the sector in the long term. Next slide, please. So from the case study, the following lessons were learned. The growth and acceptance of organic farming and food by EU farmers and consumers makes organic farming a good transition point to more sustainable farming and food systems, such as agroecology. In terms of EU CAP Pillar 2, it should provide financial incentives to transition organic dairy farms differentiated according to the complexity of agro-ecological farming practices and the performance of agri-environmental measures. And also, it was felt that policies incentivizing the adoption of organic agro-ecological practices and agri-environmental measures should integrate provision of tailored advice, training, and experience exchange for farmers. And lastly, but not least, policy supporting transition to organic dairy and agro-ecological farming practice should integrate farmer-focused supply as well as consumer-focused demand measures. Next slide. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to hearing some of your comments and questions.